Understanding and mapping supply chains is absolutely critical to disrupting illicit networks, and it's something, as Jonathan pointed out, technology can help do. And speaking of technology, I mentioned earlier in the day that YouTube has announced that it is launching a new tool to allow you to obscure faces when uploading video if you feel it's necessary. And so I decided that it was really important to demonstrate this, and to demonstrate it on somebody who definitely and clearly wanted to make sure that they were entirely disassociated from this event. So I have a very, very, very short clip to roll. Can we please roll it? They have long advocated that there be some method of obscuring faces on video. Very short clip, demonstrating the power of this new tool. You know, people have asked me, they said, Scott, you must be so tired. You must be so ready for this event to be over. You've put so much hard work into it. And I feel the complete opposite. We've put so much hard work into it that I just want to keep going and going and going. But I know we're all tired and we've had a long time here together. And so my job right now is to just review a little bit about what we accomplished together in the labs. We had policy labs, we had product labs, we had thinking labs, and we also had 3 unlabs related to data, related to illicit organ trade, and related to hotlines. And we did a lot in those labs. But rather than me talk about it, I thought I would throw it over to a short video to let you see what you had to say about them.
What happens at a lot of conferences is you just hear a series of speeches, and it's often death by PowerPoint. But what you've got here is so many opportunities to connect with very, very interesting people, so it's a very rich experience.
Labs have given us the opportunity to come together to look at very specific problems and how we can overcome them.
What I'm hoping to get out of these labs is just knowledge. Knowledge is power.
So people are going to come away from these labs with a better understanding of how they can use technology to tackle these broad global challenges.
There's many senior level people here from technology, also from government and law enforcement.
A couple of journalists.
Folks from the intelligence community.
Former child soldiers.
Pathologists.
Different organizations.
And of course, activists.
And then there's me, who's a fashion designer.
Is harnessing the power of technology to develop tools that can effectively fight illicit trade today.
How do you look at a network? How do you create a network? How are they designed? And more importantly, if they're illicit, how are you going to intervene and disrupt them?
It doesn't matter what the crime is, it's always about money.
I want more people to be able to communicate with more people, period.
When more and more people ask for access to information, that puts pressure on governments to provide that.
Information is power, and information can save lives.
Change for the better is possible if you bring the right people together and use the right tools and have the willingness to make that change happen.
With technology, we can take very active, aggressive measures against illicit trade today.
Now, we are still in the process of collecting all of the outputs from each of the labs from the Googlers who were in the labs with you. But I just wanted to note a couple of highlights. As I mentioned, we had a number of policy labs, and the Center for New American Security, which is focused on one of the key aspects of what we were looking at together here, which was how to disrupt money, has come up with a series of proposals that we're going to work on in the next 6 months to see how we might want to take those forward in particular. We've also, Google and Palantir have made a strong commitment to following up with investigative journalists on new instances where we might be able to continue the type of research and reporting that we saw and demonstrated yesterday related to the illegal and legal skin trade, but for other instances, investigative journalists telling stories, telling the world stories for policymakers and others to be able to act on them, we understand and believe is really very important. We had Karis over the last day or so really focused on the systems where violence is active and thinking through new ways and approaches to get hyper-local information and intelligence about what's happening in those systems so that you don't make the situation worse, but you begin to address it. And we'll be working with Karis over the next 6 months as well to move that work forward. We've had so many new ideas come out of this summit, but what I would like to say and what I heard from most of you was it was not necessarily or only the time together in the labs, but was the opportunity to cross-fertilize ideas with so many different sorts of people. And very clearly, that is the intent and model of Google Ideas. We want to take as many people from as many different and diverse backgrounds, mash them all together and see what happens. And typically the result is pretty amazing. So that's all I have for the labs. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to introduce to you a friend and colleague, Steward Patrick from the Council of Foreign Relations, who has collaborated with us over the past 8 months to put this event together. The Council of Foreign Relations has been a partner of Google Ideas and will continue to be a partner of Google Ideas going into the future. And Steward has helped me to organize a number of roundtables that took place over the last few months that have helped to develop the agenda that we've put together here, which I think you'll agree has been a very rich, robust agenda. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Patrick Steward. Steward Patrick, thank you. I always do that. Couldn't help it, Steward.
That's right. Thanks. I'm not the bald guy. Patrick Steward, this is actually me here. Well, I've worked at the Council on Foreign Relations for 4 years, and this is without a doubt the most exciting and thought-provoking initiative I've ever been involved in. I want to thank Jared Cohen and the entire Google Ideas team for just the tremendous work they put into this. I don't know that there's another company in the world that could have assembled the sort of talent that we have here. Who else could have assembled some of the world's greatest investigative journalists, some of the most top-notch engineers, some of the inspirational anti-crime fighters, both former and current, and most poignantly, the survivors who have transcended their own suffering at the hands of illicit networks to fight for a better world. It was a bold move for Google to take on this agenda, both because it entails some risks, but also because it builds huge expectations for what Google might accomplish going forward. But frankly, after listening to Eric Schmidt speak from this podium yesterday about using Google and using technology to create a world that's free from fear, it becomes obvious that Google is not your normal or average company. Now, only a madman would try to summarize the extraordinary insights that we've had over the past extraordinary 2 days. I'll just offer a few reflections based on what we heard from this stage and also in the labs. The summit did confirm a few of the assumptions that we had coming into this project and that we developed in the roundtable series with Google Ideas. First, the illicit economy is absolutely pervasive. It's not something that takes place on the margins of global commerce. It's deeply entwined in globalization and embedded in globalization. And each of us here is linked to it, either wittingly or unwittingly, by the very choices that we make, whether it's doing something complicit, like buying illegal drugs, for instance, or goods that we know that are pirated, or simply by doing things like buying clothes or food whose supply chains that we may not know depend on slave labor. The second thing that was confirmed was that when it comes to data on the illicit, we are often, at least up until recently, flying blind. A lot of the numbers that are tossed about in terms of the scale of human trafficking or the scope of money laundering are basically based on pure guesswork or guesstimates, even by reputable organizations like the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. You know, this is partly inevitable. Unlike Fortune 500 companies, it's not like the illicit networks and cartels are actually publishing quarterly statistics of what they're actually involved in. But it also has been because where data exists, we've lacked the tools to sift through it and to connect the dots. The third thing that's really been reconfirmed is that illicit networks flourish in the darkness. where corruption is the norm and where transparency is absent. The problem is obviously most acute in mafia states like the soprano state of North Korea that we heard so much about from some of its victims earlier in this conference. But no country is exempt from corruption, and where transparency is lacking, it's impossible for citizens to combat it. And finally, the problem of illicit networks is simply too massive and too complex to be addressed by the law enforcement efforts of a single nation alone. Nations have to cooperate more multilaterally, and that's something that our Global Governance Monitor, which the Council on Foreign Relations created, tried to examine, was what are the gaps in multilateral cooperation when it comes to their international crime regime. But this is also something that transcends interstate cooperation. It needs to involve, deeply needs to involve the private sector. It needs to involve civil society and non-governmental organizations. And it can't just be top-down. As we've seen throughout this conference, it also has to be bottom-up. Now, the good news from this summit is that illicit networks are not invincible. Forces of opposition do exist. We've seen many of them in this room, and they can be mobilized in new and creative ways. Now, I often feel like the last analog guy in a digital world. But over the past 2 days, I've been blown away, time and again, by how we might be able to harness information technology to combat illicit networks. We've seen that film itself can put a human face on the victims of human slavery and provide survivors with a voice to tell their stories in their own compelling ways. We've seen how data mining technologies can help investigative journalists uncover illicit networks, whether this is the global trade in body parts or the financing of Somali pirates. We've heard how engineers can help banks and regulators track the flows of dirty money, name and shame the miscreants, and shut down the world's laundering centers. We've learned how risk assessment tools, relying on the latest technology, can help reveal vulnerabilities in our transportation infrastructure and harden the world's choke points, whether we're talking about Dubai ports or the Panama Canal. We've watched network and analysts map the convergence among criminals, narco-traffickers, terrorists, and insurgents, including those who would want to create our biggest fear, the use of a nuclear weapon or some massive biological device in an American city or a city anywhere around the world. And finally, we've seen how social media and crowdsourcing can empower beleaguered citizens throughout the world, allowing them to report on crime and violence without necessarily placing their lives and the lives of their families at risk. And we've also seen how it can allow exploited workers to draw global attention to sweatshop labor and human slavery. So yes, we all know that technology is a double-edged sword, and it cuts both ways, but it's not one we can simply leave in the hands of the illicit networks while we unilaterally disarm. Now, before we pat ourselves on the back, let's remember that our work has just started here. Google Ideas has created what I like to think of as a new licit network, and it's our job to keep it alive and vibrant, and to leave here committed to empowering forces of opposition. Yesterday from this podium, Eric Schmidt invoked FDR's discussion about freedom from fear, so it's only appropriate to close with a well-known phrase from Churchill, who attended a few summits of his own with President Roosevelt. This summit is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end. It is at best the end of the beginning. And the Council on Foreign Relations looks forward to working with Google Ideas, with Tribeca Films, and with all of you assembled here today to try to continue this campaign going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steward Patrick, and I must say I'm really glad we got that on video because that really was the impossible to do summary of what we experienced here. And that's also a good reminder, all of the video content, with the exception of the North Korea panel, will be available at youtube.com/info2012. You've heard a lot of summaries. I want to throw it to a video to do our sort of typical Google visual audio representation of what the last couple days have been about.
International organized crime is a $2 trillion a year business and accounts for 15% of global GDP. Illicit networks are out there and they're growing.
The business of recycling dead humans has grown so large that you can buy stock in publicly traded companies that rely on corpses for their raw materials.
People are trafficked thinking that they're going to get a reasonable job in Turkey from Moldova, say, and end up in the hands of traffickers.
When there is a security guard over there with a gun and you feel pressure, what's going to happen next? He's going to kill somebody?
Whether you're working on small arms, whether you're working on drug smuggling, whether you're working on WMD, all of us are really concerned with one primary issue, and that's transparency.
Money is the lifeblood. It's also the Achilles heel, because financial trails don't lie.
It's not just about having numbers floating and matrices of data, but also really be aware that these are real stories of people being affected by illicit networks.
Yo supe cómo comenzaba esta historia y cómo terminaba. No tenía ningún sentido arriesgarme a repetirla, destruyendo la vida de más personas.
Stories of the human beings who live day in, day out within illicit networks can help us illuminate the dark corners of our understandings of this complex issue.
Someone asked me a question that's been on my mind for some time. Quote, we've been working on this for years. What could you, Eric, possibly do to improve the situation? The answer was obvious. It was technology.
Technology is a double-edged sword. For all the harm that it perhaps can contribute to, it has the ability to do good.
Let's create 3D printed organs so that there's no point in selling them. Let's ruin the market for the smugglers rather than going after the smugglers themselves.
A combination of people willing and committed to go out in the field and work on this, willing to put their lives at risk, and good and clever technology can make it a lot easier.
A number of schoolgirls in a town on the Libyan coast began to mark on the Google Maps with a sort of pin markers areas where regime snipers and regime artillery positions were located.
The potential of change depends on the common will of different partners.
We're not talking about something insurmountable. We're not talking about something that you can't get engaged with. We're talking about something that's actually graspable.
If we can connect people who are on the front lines working on this challenge every single day with some of the smartest people in the engineering world who understand the tools, that's a marriage that we want to make happen.